All right, I think I'll just go ahead and get started here. Welcome. Thanks for joining for this new installment in FairVote's ongoing series of webinars on American elections. Great to have so many people signed up today. I'm Rob Richie. I'm president and CEO of FairVote. We're a national electoral reform organization that focuses in particular on ranked choice voting and the Fair Representation Act in Congress, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. Our topic is America's polarization crisis, a crisis most dramatically evidenced both in and outside the US Capitol on January 6th, but one that we're seeing in varying forms in states around the nation. Our focus will be on our outdated electoral rules that poorly represent so many Americans, and we believe create campaign incentives that drive and reinforce the political polarization that we'll be talking about today. Most of our world's leading democracies have chosen different electoral rules, and we have our own rich history at a state level, and seen it more and more of better voting models, including the use of ranked choice voting in presidential and congressional elections in Maine and Alaska today. By adopting the Fair Representation Act, the US could switch in one fell swoop to what we call proportional ranked choice voting, where the combination of ranked choice voting ballot with larger fairly drawn districts would transform elections, representation, and governance. FairVote in this webinar series has been talking with some of the most visionary thinkers in the electoral reform space about how we can create the kind of democracy that lives up to our highest ideals and helps allow for the kind of politics and leadership we need during this especially challenging moment. Today's conversation promises to be yet another exceptional one. We have three of our nation's top thinkers on this issue with us, experts who have thought deeply about problems of representation and the toxicity incentivized by use of winner-take-all single-choice elections. I'm going to start by introducing Yuval Levin. Yuval is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and the editor of National Affairs. He's a contributing editor of National Review, and his essays and articles have appeared in our nation's leading publications. He's the author of several books, most recently, A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. He also served in George W. Bush's White House on domestic policy and previously as a congressional staffer. He holds a PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. I had a rich conversation with him last week that will kick off our event before we go live with Danielle Allen and Kevin Kosar. And Emily, let's go ahead and turn to that recorded conversation now. Thanks so much for being here today, Yuval. And I just wanted to jump right into this. As you look at the divide between the parties, how much fault would you say lies with individual leaders, and how much with the incentives that govern the behavior and actions of those leaders? And would you agree that a focus on the former, that it's the fault of individuals, is dangerous for sustaining democracy, while a focus on the latter, that there's institutional incentives that are a problem, is a more productive way to move forward with the intent of secure and sustaining change?
Yeah, I certainly think that's right, that even when the problems we see are functions of poor choices, bad behavior, we still have to ask ourselves why. The people in the system are not crazy. They're responding to incentives. And when we think as reformers about how to create a system that encourages better behavior, we have to think about incentives. And I also think that that logic is really one of the deepest insights that's embedded in our system of government, that institutional structure shapes political culture. That's really just a core insight of the Federalist, of James Madison's political thinking. And it's very much reflected in our system that takes incentives very seriously, recognizes that the design of the government will create the culture in which its politics happens. And I think really, ultimately, there have been times when we've needed to change the system precisely for that reason, to change our electoral system too, how the president is chosen, how the Senate is elected, in response to dissatisfaction with the kinds of politics that our electoral system was creating. So I think if we're worried about political culture, which we ought to be, that should lead us to think about incentives and therefore institutional reform.
Yeah, I quite agree. And as you think about the House of Representatives in particular, and you think about within the whole ecosystem of US governance and the Constitution and the role of the Senate and the role of the presidency, how would you like to see the House functioning, and how would you like to see its power kind of in relationship to other elements of our government, and how far is it from your vision of how it would be today?
Well, I think our Constitution really envisions Congress at the center, and in a sense, the House of Representatives at the center as the most representative branch of our government. And more importantly than that, as the place where differences get worked out. I think when we think about how Congress should be different than it is, that really is of the essence, that Congress needs to function as an arena of contention and accommodation and bargaining. That's just the purpose of the legislature in our system. It's not the only way to think about a legislature. There are European democracies, no less legitimate than ours, that think about their parliaments in a way that says the majority party should have all the power to do everything it needs to do until the public throws it out. And that's what the legislature does. Our Congress has never really worked that way. We've always thought about Congress as a place where differences have to get worked out. And that means that Congress has to be representative in a very particular way. It has to represent something like the fine-grained diversity of our political culture in such a way that allows factions to form within our two broad parties, and so allows deals to get made between one part of this party and one part of that party. Right now, the Congress is distinctly bad at doing exactly that. And I think that is a response to political incentives. We're in a situation where the partisan incentives drive everything toward party cohesion and unity. Leadership is centralized. The way in which members get elected has to do with appealing to their primary electorate rather than building a broad tent. And all of that drives members away from dealing with some portion of the other party, so that we have to think about, why isn't Congress performing its basic function, enabling accommodation, compromise, bargaining to happen? And it's just simply the case that a crucial reason for that has to do with the electoral incentives that members face. And so in thinking about how to change Congress, we certainly should think about changes to the institution, budget process reforms, committee system reforms, changing how the leadership works. But we also have to think about how members get elected, because ultimately that is the most powerful incentive that any politician confronts in a democracy.
Right. And that's a nice lead into the proposals that FairVote has historically focused on, and I know you've been writing well about, and just wanted to hear your thoughts on connecting them to what you were just saying. But so the ranked choice voting ballot compared to the single choice ballot, multi-member districts versus the single member district, how do you see those kind of related?
Yeah, well, if you think about that definition of the problem that I suggested, which is, in a sense, I would say we don't have enough constructive factionalism within the parties now. The two parties are two cohesive blocks, and that doesn't allow for enough cross-partisan bargaining. An important part of the reason for that is that the parties have become these big, huge yes or no questions. You have to be all or nothing, when in fact our politics doesn't really work that way. There are more fine-grained distinctions in the electorate. And one appeal of ranked choice voting is exactly that it could allow for more fine-grained representation that way, so that you don't just have red districts and blue districts, but you have shades of purple all over the place. There are a lot of parts of our country where we now have durable, large, but totally unrepresented minority voices. Republicans in California, Democrats in Nebraska, there are a lot of them in both cases, and a lot like them all over the country, but they don't get heard, and their distinct priorities don't even get represented within their own party coalitions. Something like ranked choice voting, combined, I think, with multi-member districts, which in the House is really an essential combination, to my mind, would help to reshuffle those partisan politics in a way that would encourage both parties to pursue broader coalitions, that would create factions in the congressional parties that would have a better chance of working with each other. And again, that's alongside reforms of Congress that you'd need. But I think what it allows you to do is broaden the definition of Democrat and Republican. We have a durable two-party system in our country. It's pretty entrenched in state law, in our political culture, but within there are still differences in our electorate that, if they don't get represented between parties, have to somehow get represented within parties. And allowing for the kind of finer-grained representation that ranked choice voting and multi-member districts can allow for would make that difference. And I think that it would not empower one party over another. There's a mistake that I think a lot of Republicans make, to see this kind of electoral reform as basically benefiting Democrats and to resist it instinctively. But I think the evidence just simply does not support that view. And there are a lot of ways in which this could change our political culture in ways that would factionalize both parties, but I mean that in a good way. And I don't think the political valence of that would help the right more than the left or vice versa in any necessary way.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up that point about factions because it is a word that often feels pejorative. And it's like, oh, oh my gosh, it's breaking down into factions. And James Madison, didn't he warn against factions? And so tell us a little more about sort of.
Well, look, Madison warned against two factions, right? When you read Federalist 10, the warning there is that if the country breaks down into two large factions, then our politics becomes a civil war. What was Madison's solution to that? His solution to that was more factions, was diversifying the electoral system in a way that allows these different groups to check each other, but also to better represent the diversity of the underlying society. And I think that's the right way to think about it, that ultimately, if the purpose of Congress is deal making, then you can't just have two almost evenly matched parties, each of which always thinks that after the next election, we're going to win everything and we're not going to have to deal with these people anymore. That's the politics we've been living with now for the last 30 years, and it doesn't work. And Congress in particular doesn't work in that kind of politics. But if you have more conservative Democrats, more liberal Republicans, more regional differences that are expressed, the effect of that is not a breakdown into factions that just fight with each other and can't get anything done. It becomes more obvious that you have to deal with each other. And there come to be more opportunities for that kind of deal making and for that kind of bargaining, which ultimately is what the legislature is for. So I think specifically within Congress, and even more specifically within the House of Representatives, we would be well served by having more meaningful, durable intra-party factions. That would tend to weaken the leadership some, which would be good for Congress. It would tend to make the everyday work of legislating, the work of the committees, more significant. More work would get done in that place. It's not a silver bullet. I don't want to suggest it, but in combination with reforms of the institution, it could make a dramatic difference against the particular kinds of problems that we see in today's Congress.
Right, makes a lot of sense. And wanted to kind of get into two particulars that, so there's a bill in Congress that we've been associated with, been working with Congressman Don Beyer. A growing number of members are on the bill. It's a very sort of bold proposal, the Fair Representation Act, soon to be reintroduced. There are a couple of policy choices in it that I just thought I'd sort of sound out your thoughts on. One relates a little bit to this one about factions. So it's a particular mechanistic decision, but we're one of the rare countries that the government gets involved in administering and structuring primary elections, the nomination process. But that does mean they get more professionally run than, say, the Iowa caucuses, and they have more people voting. And there's a choice to be made if you're having multi-member districts with ranked choice voting in the general election. Do you also establish that in the primary election? Which one result of that is that then the parties would be nominating more parts of their tent, right? Because it's a proportional outcome. And so, if it's 3 seats being nominated, there would be, sort of the left, center, and right, however that is simplistically defined from that primary electorate. Or you could just get rid of primaries. So one of the really strong thinkers in this field is Lee Drutman, who wrote the book Doom Loop and things. And Lee's of the feeling well, maybe we could get rid of the primaries and the parties might promote a more homogenous kind of team. And there might just be more of a multi-party system compared to sort of a multi-faction system. And I guess I wanted to get your thoughts about, using ranked choice voting, multi-member districts in the primary, and sort of the implications of what that means for, say, the differing values of going to more of a multi-party house versus one that might have some other parties, but more reliably would have sort of more factions represented within the major parties.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. And I guess I would say, I think it's worth experimenting with that, but I'm far from certain on that front. I would put it this way. I think that the primary system as we have it is itself a kind of failed experiment, that it was launched for reasons that are understandable, and you can see the arguments made for it in the late 60s and into the 1970s in both parties. It has not had the effect that was desired, and it has had some very, very detrimental effects. And I worry that reforms like these that we're talking about, which I think would work, might not work. And we have to think about what it would mean to experiment with these in ways that let us see what the actual implications are. I think that may be especially true in terms of getting the law involved in the primary system to an even greater degree than it already is. My sense is if you have ranked choice voting in the general election, then the state parties would be wise to choose their candidates through ranked choice voting in the primaries. But I don't think they should be required to do so. And I wouldn't say that the law should involve itself too much in the structure of primary elections. The danger is simply making a big mistake that's then hard to reverse. And it's probably a better idea to make smaller mistakes and see if we can learn from them along the way and improve the system. So I would say the logic of it makes sense to me, but I think we have to be cautious here about the kinds of changes we're making, because once made, they can be hard to reverse and they can have effects that we don't expect.
Right. Very, very thoughtful. To another bold proposal, and I can imagine how your answer is going to be based on the previous one, but I think it's a really fun one for us to be mulling, is so the Fair Representation Act also, in contrast to a bill from 10, 20 years ago, there was bills in previous Congresses that would say, you know what, let's just drop the requirement that currently exists, most recently expressed in a 1967 law that mandates single member districts.
Mm-hmm.
Every House member has to come from a single member district. No House member represents any of the same people that anyone else does. And that actually wasn't the case as recently as the 1960s in a couple states, and in the earlier Congresses in our history, it was quite common to have multi-member districts. But at one point, so Congress said, you know what, we should have everyone from single member districts. There's a certain sense of value of a continuity of a representative system that they thought would be fair in not thinking ahead to gerrymandering, then sort of allowing, you know, some multi-member districts and some not. So the Fair Representation Act sort of goes with that sensibility and says, you know what, let's all be fair together. Single member districts actually aren't fair. So let's require, you know, multi-member districts and proportional voting across all of the states at once, one big bold change. And I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on that and sort of alternate models that might be attractive to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can probably imagine from the last exchange that I worry about it. I'm a believer in experimentation. I don't think that it makes sense to change the entire system in a centralized way. State by state seems the more appropriate way. That would still require congressional action. It would still require undoing that prohibition on multi-member districts. But I don't think I would impose that all at once. And I also think that allowing the states to take it on at their own pace makes it more likely that Congress would actually get the majority together to actually undo those the 67 law for single member districts. And so it gives us more of a chance of actually getting there. You know, the example you pointed to of the emergence of modern day gerrymandering, of course, there's always been gerrymandering, but the emergence of it in response to some of the changes made in the late 60s is an example of something we ought to worry about. That is, if we create a new system here, the incentives to game that somehow would be very powerful. And maybe we can't imagine how that would work right now, but somebody more imaginative might come up with it. And we want to be careful not to make one big mistake. So that's my view in general. It's why I believe in federalism. It's why I think our system allows us ways of making incremental improvements. Obviously, that can be frustrating and it can be slow and take time. But I think ultimately it gives us a better chance of building this public support and legitimacy behind it, and of avoiding a serious error. So I'm inclined not to centralize.
Yeah, no, and that's going to be a sort of debate going forward. And they're not necessarily in because at some point,
yeah,
you know, we hope some more states are going to experiment with this and so on. So this has been terrific. So thanks so much. Wish you could be live with our next guest, but I guess in lieu of that, you know them both well. Danielle Allen and Kevin Kosar are about to be joining us when we shift to live. Are there any sort of final comments you'd like to make to sort of help, because they'll have seen this, they'll be like going into the live conversation. Any things you would like to sort of seed into the next conversation before we
well, the two of them certainly don't need help from me. They're two of the most public spirited people I've ever met in my life, and I think they'll agree with this point that I would make very much. But I would just say that I think the important thing for all of us in this moment is to try to get into the mindset that sees reform as achievable. that believes that we are not stuck with a dysfunctional system, and that changing that system is itself a way to build some unity, to overcome some of our divisions. A lot can be done without changing the Constitution. And even if we come to the view that some constitutional changes are needed, that's achievable too. The system comes with an adaptive mechanism, a series of them that allow us to improve things when they don't work. And we need to see that the problems we face require cultural change, which also means they require structural change, and just get ourselves into the habit of talking about how things could be better and how we get there, rather than just stopping at diagnosis and saying this has failed and that has failed and therefore we're stuck. We're not stuck. It's up to us. And these coming years can be a period of reform if we can see that that kind of action, that kind of change is within our reach. We're a self-governing people, and the system is here to serve us, not the other way around.
Well said. And our slogan is a more perfect union, and partly to capture that spirit. We've always been open to change, and we often think that whatever we have today was dictated on stone by James Madison, and it's not true. And that's the conversation we always should have. Thanks so much. It's been terrific to talk, Yuval, and
thank you very much.
We will continue. So thank you. So I think we are live, and oh my goodness, we have our guests as well. I really enjoyed that conversation with Yuval. I hope you all did. Again, he's not here live with us, but we have two really terrific speakers, thinkers to join us. And so let me just introduce Danielle Allen and Kevin Kosar, and say a little bit more about things, and then we'll kick into the conversation. So Danielle Allen is the James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard University, Director of Harvard's Edmund Safra Center for Ethics. She's a political theorist who has published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, and history of political thought. Her books include Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of Citizenship since Brown versus the Board of Education, and our declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence and Defense of Equality. She's co-editor of the award-winning Education, Justice, and Democracy, and is a former chair of the Mellon Foundation Board and the Pulitzer Prize Board. She's a co-chair of a commission convened by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to examine the state of our democracy, and its trailblazing Our Common Purpose report was released last year. Kevin Kosar is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute with Yuval, where he studies the US Congress, election reform, the administrative state, American politics, and the US Postal Service. Before joining AEI, Dr. Kosar was at the R Street Institute, including as Vice President of Policy, and spent more than a decade working for the Congressional Research. He has taught public policy at NYU and lectured on public administration at Metropolitan College of New York. His most recent of his 4 books is Congress Overwhelmed: The Decline in Congressional Capacity and Prospects for Reform. He has a doctorate from NYU. We want to, you in the audience to be involved today as well. I see people are already realizing they can do that, but I'm going to pose the first questions, then we'll open it up to all of you via chat. If you have questions you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A in the chat functions below, and you can go ahead and leave those anytime. Our FairVote team will monitor those fields throughout the conversation. So Danielle, great to have you here. Let me turn to you first. I'm so glad to have your insights, and a big fan of your work, both on your own and in the collectively authored Our Common Purpose report from last year. You've just heard Yuval share his vision of how the US House should operate, the concept of constructive factionalism. Tell me what most resonates with you and how it relates to the role of Congress envisioned by our founders and how it has operated over the years.
Thanks so much, Rob. Thank you for having this important conversation. I share Yuval's enthusiasm for the idea that we should increase the size of the House, and that this could be a critical reform that could unlock a lot of the paralysis in our system. There are a few dimensions of this from my point of view. There's the fact that it's actually not straightforward that such a reform advantages one party or the other. And so in that regard, there's a kind of window of opportunity for getting such a reform through. There's also the fact that it would introduce new seats and therefore make it possible for a greater diversity of the American population to put themselves forward for office and to help diversify the House. Of course, also it brings down the number of constituents that any given representative has, and therefore is an opportunity too to increase the direct responsiveness of representatives to their constituents, to sort of tighten the connection between the people and Congress once again. But for me, its most, in some sense, important consequence is to also achieve a reweighting of the Electoral College. The Electoral College, of course, is created out of the number of members of Congress and members of Senate that we have. And so if we increase the size of the House, then what we're also doing is rebalancing the relative weightings of more populous and less populous parts of the country. And we put ourselves in a position where the likelihood of a split between the popular vote and the Electoral College outcome is a rare probability event, a low probability event. That's what it was designed to be. Because of the cap on Congress, we've gotten ourselves into a place where the probability of that kind of split just keeps increasing over time as the demography of the country changes. That's very, very dangerous. Will really erode our legitimacy if the split between popular vote and Electoral College is a reasonably common probability occurrence from one election to the next. So I think this is a critical reform, gives dynamism to our system, an opportunity to be imaginative and creative, and also addresses one of the fundamental problems challenging the legitimacy of our politics at the moment.
Let me follow up a little bit on that. I guess I would say, as I look around the country, the legislatures that are of different sizes per capita don't necessarily be experiencing a much difference in sort of partisan polarization, political polarization. In some ways, a smaller legislature, they can be a little more collegial because there's only 9 of them on, it's kind of crazy, but my county council has 9 people to represent more than 1 million residents, but at least they kind of all get to know one another. So what about the role of the election system itself? Does it matter how we elect these people? Because I know our common purpose has a whole lot of recommendations and everyone should rush to read that report because of the full gamut of things in it. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that report, but I'd like to push a little bit further into whether it matters how the House is elected the way that Yuval was talking about.
I do think it does matter. I am a supporter of the Fair Representation Act and think that the combination of ranked choice voting and multi-member districts is also critical. That is also in our common purpose report. We make that recommendation. So increasing the size of the House, I think, brings value from the point of view of increasing responsiveness, increasing representativeness, increasing legitimacy. But if the question is polarization and what to do about that, increasing the size of the House will not do it on its own. It is definitely also our electoral systems. We need electoral systems that incentivize candidates to campaign to cross that 50% threshold, and that incentivize the forming of coalitions across broad spectrums of the population. So lots more to be said about those electoral systems, but yes, we definitely need those reforms too if we're going to tackle polarization.
Well, thank you. And hey, Kevin, thanks for being patient, and I'd love to bring you in on the conversation. I guess I'd just start with a general opening. What did you hear today from Yuval and Danielle that you most agree with? And are there any differences you might want to lift up?
I can't recall hearing anything I disagree with. They both hit upon some really extraordinary points.
Again.
Yes, try again. I would say, as somebody who has watched Congress closely since 2003, I would want to just add a few observations drawn from that experience. The first of which gets to your question, Rob, about electoral incentives. I studied political science for a decade, but when I got to DC, I was not prepared for seeing how intensely the electoral incentives matter, particularly in the House. And what we've been seeing over the passing of decades, as the parties have sorted themselves out into these kind of ideologically cohesive blocks for the most part, and that the competition for control of Congress has pinballed back and forth at a rate way more rapidly than we've seen since the post-Civil War days. The focus on election incentives has got amped ever higher. It's shot through the whole of Congress, through its structure, through its behavior. And I think in the last couple of months, we saw a couple of votes that really underscored the connection between electoral incentives and behavior. The vote January 6th on whether to, or not January 6th, post January 6th, to post facto impeach President Trump. Look at the GOP vote. Very few voted, despite everything. Very few voted to impeach the former president. Then, in a connected issue, should Lynn Cheney be thrown out of the House Republican Conference? That vote was conducted in secret. And overwhelmingly, they voted to keep her, despite her sticking her thumb in the eye of the president and taking a principled stand. Why? Because nobody who casts that vote on the Lynn Cheney issue can be primaried on it. It was secret. So yeah, incentives hugely matter. Another wrinkle that I want to put out there as an observation about how Congress is working now is that I feel that thanks to electoral incentives, we have kind of two broad policy tracks. One involves high salient issues that can really motivate the base, like immigration, abortion, and now big tech has become one of those things. And then there's everything else. How can we reform and improve our national park system, for example? Two separate tracks. The behavior of Congress on those two separate tracks is utterly dissonant. Congress, as political scientists Francis Lee, James Curry have shown, actually does push through a significant amount of bipartisan stuff. But so much falls into that high salience bucket, and they are gridlocked on them because nobody wants to get out of their partisan foxhole and cross the aisle because they don't want to get primaried. Just the other week, I was speaking with somebody who's worked in the Senate for many years. And I was talking to him about, how things were going there. Does it seem functional or dysfunctional? And his response was, it doesn't feel like we're in a legislature. Basically, we've hit a point where members are so worried about being primaried that they've cut a deal with leadership. We won't try to do amendments and behave the way we expect legislators to do, like have open debates on the floor that are substantive and involve actual bargaining. You don't see that on C-SPAN at all. We're not going to do that stuff. We're going to give that up and let you, the leadership, in return, protect us from votes we're afraid to take. And if we have to, well, we'll take the votes, but please roll those policies into some massive omnibus that camouflages and that we can use as an excuse for casting those votes. That's where we are right now. And yeah, the electoral incentives have very heavily driven us to this situation.
When I started at FairVote in the early 90s, just to sort of give examples for me, there's a question to come about what it means for you, but just things that have changed. So back in the early 90s, more than a quarter of US House seats were represented by someone whose presidential nominee of their party had lost that district. So they were in kind of the other party's turf, about more than 1 out of 4. Today, that's less than 4%. So, fewer than 1 out of 25 are in the other party's turf. And so that emphasizes the importance of the primary because if, 96% of districts are lined up with the party and most of those are just exceptionally safe, that's kind of a change in voting patterns, a change in what we see. Another big change for me is say, Southern state legislative chambers in the early 90s. Every single one was run by the Democratic Party, which at that point was a white African-American coalition. And now none of those chambers are run by Democrats and they're all Republican. These have happened, just in the last 25 years. What would you say in sort of as Congress operates, would you say is the most, comparable difference that we might not see as much, but you would sort of know is sort of different, say the role of committees as one example?
Well, yeah, I would say the entire model for how Congress operates has shifted. I mean, just to step back and get to the kind of meta level, the reason we have a Congress is so these dissonant portions of our nation can come together through representation and instead of throttling each other in the streets, have discussions and hopefully come to some harmony, some consensus of some sort. That's the whole purpose of Congress. And what we've seen is that the internal structure of Congress has very much changed, and its role, particularly on the salient issues that I've flagged, has changed. It's actually driving dissonance. As members of Congress seem to think that their most important job is to get on television or get on Twitter and say really outrageous things to demonize others, which of course they do for the sake of raising money and also pleasing the most partisan, highly motivated voters who are going to stay with them in the primaries. 50 years ago and still 30 years ago, Congress was a more disaggregated system. There was less power at the top. You had a lot more kind of power chieftains down below. And that kind of naturally let pluralism work because there are all sorts of places through which interests could come. Now, some folks will say, oh, well, we had iron triangles and we had bad interests getting in there. Absolutely. That's pluralism for you. Not all interests are going to be just and wonderful. Some are going to be very self-interested at the cost to others. But there were many entryways, and the policy agenda was much more wide open in terms of what was getting voted and moved through Congress. And you had things like conference committees, where the House and the Senate would meet together and hash things out. Those become extinct. Essentially, for things to get done on salient issues, if anybody's going to even try, it's going to run through leadership. If it involves spending, well, it's going to be done at the very last moment before a government shutdown, when everybody can make the excuse that they're doing it to avoid some calamity. And the book I did on congressional capacity was about the kind of atrophying of the institutional attributes that enabled Congress to be this messy, disaggregated, but nonetheless very productive entity that well served our polity.
So Danielle, as you hear that and you think about your deep knowledge of history and how the House may have operated at different times and how the framers imagined it working, are there times which we've seen something like this happen before and then we've sort of got, like, are there cycles that we can learn from where in fact there's been something like this before? Or would you say it's unique in what's happening? And maybe I'll offer the opportunity to connect some of what Kevin was talking about with the idea of a bigger House. What would you do with those extra 100, 200 House members? Are there ways you can imagine them operating within the House that in fact would not just be sort of a numerical game for the Electoral College, but in fact, as individual representatives, help the House function better?
Thank you, Rob. Well, the legislature is key for any healthy constitutional democracy. I mean, it is the beating heart, has the job of articulating the will of the people, fundamentally setting the strategic direction for the country. We've kind of come to believe that that's the job of the executive. It's not the original conception of the thing for various reasons. And the value of the legislature in really articulating that will of the people is the fact that it really does cover the whole of the people, and the executive may or may not choose to try to speak for the whole of the people. I think we've seen considerable variation in the degree to which the executive wants to actually try to imagine the whole and speak for the whole. So the legislature is key. Of course, in the very beginning, there was a very substantial problem of breakdown, under the period of the Articles of Confederation, where they couldn't even get a quorum of people coming to Congress. And they couldn't get a quorum precisely because it was so impossible to get any business done, and it wasn't worth anybody's time to be there. And so there is a danger in the current situation. At this point, it's worth people's time to be there because it's a way of, in effect, keeping a job. But more generally, it is really, I think lots of people do feel like it's not clear that their time is well spent. So that is where I do think the question of committees is critical. And I would hope that an increase in the size of the House would provide an opportunity to reinvigorate processes of learning and deliberation. So Kevin pointed to the fact that we see, no substantive deliberation. It's also the case that we just don't see as much learning happening in Congress as in past eras, where there's a point in time where we could really count on Congress to have the state-of-the-art knowledge on any particular subject. Whereas I think very often now Congress is having to play catch up. To some extent, this reflects budget decisions that were made in the early 90s that really stripped research capacity out of Congress. I think that was a huge mistake. So I will say, this is a place where I think we, the people, should invest in Congress. We should not just increase the size of the House, but we should invest in its research capacity so that we can restore it as a functioning body that is able to bring knowledge in from all over the entirety of the country, connect that to strong research capacity, really learn, and be able to innovate from that learning. And I would hope we would also actually be able to connect the working of a bigger Congress to the use of more digital tools to engage constituents in forms of iterative and responsive ongoing conversation. So I don't think we should just increase the size of the House to change the numbers. I think that we should bring real intentionality to the design of its operation. There is a committee operating now with the charge of thinking through how to modernize Congress. And I hope that charge needs to be taken in a really substantive way, and to focus on the question of how to restore these functions that were so critical in the original design. Again, the sort of pooling of knowledge, bringing knowledge from the whole country together, strengthening the kind of research capacity that's applied to that knowledge, and then providing meaningful spaces for deliberation. I will add one more point on this. This is not said out loud very often. It's not in our report, but there is evidence to suggest, that the sort of extensive coverage of all the proceedings has really eroded the capacity of the body to function. And so I do think, transparency is a hugely important value without any question. But I think we ought to give, direct attention to the question of, can we give Congress some space, again, for deliberation, that we don't have to have the cloak pulled back all the time, so that they can actually think and carry out the fullness of their responsibility.
So one of the things that's changed over the last pretty recent times, even more dramatically, is the fact that U.S. Senate delegations are now, the 2 senators per state tend to line up now by party much more clearly than they used to. But so Kevin, one of the things that's interesting or important to me about the Fair Representation Act model, multi-member districts with ranked choice voting in the United States, would be that inevitably, almost very reliably, every district would elect representatives from more than one party. So New York City would not just have Democrats, rural Texas would not just have Republicans, but there would be a mix of parties. And so when you think about congressional capacity, and you think, an area of great expertise for you, and so you think about bigger districts, but shared representatives, right? So you sort of share constituents with people from a different party. There's a history of the Senate showing that works. Obviously, every state has 2 senators, so they share constituents. But what do they need to make that work? And what value would you say there is or isn't of having people of both parties representing the same people?
Well, yeah, first, we go to the basic math, which is that the typical representative, if there is such a one in the House, has something like 747,000 constituents, which, go back 100 years, and that was the number was like a seventh of that or something. Imagine yourself trying to be that representative and trying to parse what 750,000 people want and to respond to their needs. I think that's one thing that is often forgotten, is that members of Congress don't just come here and give speeches and dodge tough votes. They spend a lot of their time helping constituents with various issues, working with administrative agencies that are dispensing benefits, or getting a member of the military who's died, buried at Arlington Cemetery. They play ombudsman. And to try to do that for 750,000 people is unbelievable. I also found that the average congressional office gets over 46,000 communications per year from its constituents. That's like running a small corporation. It's an immense job, a huge logistical challenge, a huge PR challenge. Now members have to manage their lives across multiple platforms. It's not just like the 3 big news channels anymore and the state newspaper that they had to pay attention to, which is what they did 50, 70 years ago. It's an immense job. So there's a real argument for making that job a little more manageable by having more members of Congress and reducing that ratio from 1 to 750,000 to 1 to something a bit more manageable. And with that is going to have to come just the recognition about the immensity of the role of Congress. You look at the Constitution, look at the executive branch, Article 2 versus Article 1. Congress has most of the powers. They have all sorts of responsibilities. You know, you want to nominate somebody to high office? Well, guess what? That's something for the Senate to do. We're to the point where the Senate is having to process something like 1,000 nominations a year. That's a ton of work, but we continue to kind of cling to like, oh, no, let's keep Congress small because a smaller Congress is somehow better and it's going to cost us less money and et cetera, when the job just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Well, guess what? If you don't grow the institution to meet the challenge, if you do, as Danielle pointed to, cut the number of committee staff, cut the number of nonpartisan individuals who work in the legislative branch support agency to help Congress think better about how to make policy and to do oversight. No wonder governance is getting dysfunctional. And when you start to give people more than one member to whom they could shop their concerns, that sounds like a good thing to me, because one of the alarming things I've seen about the way members of Congress run for re-election is that they have become really good at it. And when I say good, not in a moral sense, but in a utilitarian sense, they know where to spend their time. They've got metrics, they got data, they got all sorts of stuff. And if this person is not part of their party and they don't calculate that person is likely to vote for them, why waste the time over there? It's irrational, which basically means you're denying certain people representation in the name of pursuing electoral incentives.
So probably a part of the problem is that the portion of our federal budget that goes to funding congressional salaries and staff must be what, 30-40% of the budget now? Or
if only, yeah. No,
because I think people sometimes think it's that, but probably what, it's like 0.0001 or something like that.
Oh yeah, something like 0.0001%. And as a portion of the total federal budget, it is actually declined. And the legislative branch budget as a whole, more and more portions of it have been devoted to basically security, Capitol Police, and the upkeep of the plant, all those massive buildings. It's not being spent on people. Congressional staff, who are so essential to policymaking, oversight, and getting good constituent response, they turn over pretty rapidly on Capitol Hill because the pay is not good. The hours are miserable. They're overworked. And if you look at their total compensation package, it's just not comparable to the private sector. So they leave.
Yeah. Well, I do want to open this up to the audience. I know we've got a lot of questions coming in. I did want to, before I did that though, I wanted to pose a question to you, Danielle, sort of to think about changes of the magnitude that we're talking about. I know you've thought a lot about how change might happen. Sort of different models of how we could change Congress. There's, a bold, big changes by Congress itself, like the Fair Representation Act, which isn't yet introduced in this Congress, but shortly will. It was HR 4000 in the last Congress. It could change the size of the House of Representatives in one fell swoop, as it did every 10 years for most of our history. But we also could have like states, the laboratories of democracy, keep building. Maine and Alaska are using ranked choice voting. We keep sort of bubbling up. What seems most likely to you, and what would you advise, people watching this webinar, what they might best do to help bring change?
So, I think there are a few different dimensions. I do think states bubbling up laboratories of democracy with experimentation is extremely valuable, because at the end of the day, we're talking about the kinds of changes that do not require necessarily a constitutional amendment, but do have, de facto sort of constitutional significance. They can sort of, substantially rearrange incentive structures in ways that would change how we do our business and reset equilibria patterns for the country. I think when you are talking about changes of that kind, you cannot avoid the importance of building up broad legitimacy for those changes. And I do think that the way to do that in our current political moment is really to focus on the bubbling up of this through the states. And there comes a tipping point moment. It doesn't mean you have to get to 50 states, for example, really driving these reforms forward or building a big coalition in support of them. There comes a tipping point where it then does make sense to go ahead and push the federalization of something, even if that has to be pushed with on the backs of one party more than another. But I think you want to do that after you've achieved really substantial legitimacy across a significant number of states.
And Kevin, what would you, if you could wave a wand, what would you like Congress most to do on these issues itself in the next couple of years? Like if something could happen in Congress on electoral changes that might change the incentives, what would be high on your list?
Well, I guess I'm biased towards institutional sort of responses. I would want each chamber to have a dedicated committee that is fully staffed, well-funded, and that doesn't have a timeout date when it just disappears, that is devoted to building the internal consensus to enact the reforms. I think it's unfortunate now that we're in a spot where there's so much distrust within the chamber for structural changes that good ideas get shot like clay pigeons. And I think, this is where Danielle referenced the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. I think very highly of that committee because it is a place where people are building trust and working with each other. And it's been very successful, and they have been doing kind of small ball reform type things to fix Congress, but they can move on to bigger things. You got a baby step before you can do the big strides. And institutionally, I feel like something like that would be very helpful for both chambers because, again, the distrust makes it really hard to pull off big bang change.
Great. Well, thanks. Let me get into some of the questions. We've got a lot of them, so maybe I'll read some of them off, and then we'll just see which ones we can get through. But so there's a lot of concern in many quarters about some of the electoral laws in states. The Georgia law has triggered an all-star game boycott, and the big ads in the New York Times and Washington Post today that people should take a look at from a lot of leading business leaders and others calling for upholding the right to vote. I guess what I would say with that question is, so what does that mean for what we can do, we should do for change, but also does it raise questions about whether we're at a really much more basic level of a conversation about democracy of just like, hey, can we keep suffrage rights? And is some of this structural stuff kind of a luxury, or are they connected? Maybe I'll give both of you a chance to talk about that, because I know that there's a nuanced way to look about some of what's going on in states, but obviously a way that's deeply concerning to many people. So I'll start with you, Danielle.
Well, I think the thing in the Georgia legislation that's the most concern to me is the transfer of power to, in effect, party representatives with regard to decision-making around the electoral process, the sort of effort to change the balance of power on that. That's the thing that's most concerning to me in it. And yes, I do think it does change the dynamic of the conversation we're having about reform. I do think that, I grew up, 70s, 80s, 90s, thinking I lived in a country that had indeed fully, comprehensively, and permanently committed to the concept of universal suffrage. I understood the history, I was aware of the challenges and so forth, but I actually thought we had turned that corner. And now we do have question marks about that, for real. And the question marks are as much about, I think, not clarifying precisely where people stand. And so in that regard, I do think that the moment is here to call the question and to declare ourselves for universal suffrage and to articulate the terms of proving that. And precisely what are the terms of proving that? From my point of view, it could possibly be adopting this Australian method of universal voting, treating voter duty like jury duty, mandatory, minimal fine if you don't participate. And then the technical job is one of getting ballots into people's hands. Questions of election integrity certainly matter, but it's then the responsibility, the burden is actually on government to make sure everybody gets the ballot, as opposed to the other way around, where right now the burden is on the voter to make sure the voter gets the ballot. That would be one way. Another way would be automatic voter registration. And I think we should have a conversation about what the right way is of articulating that commitment to universal suffrage. And I do think we have to go ahead and pitch in on that front. I don't think that means we should walk back from the other reform efforts. Not at all. I think to the degree that we have reforms that could break up the dynamics of our party polarization, they are as existentially important as a bright line affirmation of a commitment to universal suffrage.
Yeah, I see the two things you mentioned as being very much connected. When I see what's happening in many states, it's not people coming together and saying, how can we work together to create the most, fair and just and inclusive and rational sort of voting system. It's two warring parties, one trying to tilt the rules in a way that further favors them. And this is why things are being pushed through frequently along party line votes, because they are doing calculations that if they tweak this rule and change that and that it's going to be just enough to get them a steady majority consistently so that they can win. Again, I think it's very easy for us to say politicians are a bunch of dunces and they don't know what they're doing, but all evidence is that they really know what they're doing, which is how to win. How to set things up so that they win, whether it's in how they behave in legislatures, how they behave in front of cameras, how they, aim to structure electoral systems. It's all about winning. And that's where we have to start asking ourselves about the larger game that's being played. We've seen it in boxing, we've seen it in football, we've seen it elsewhere where there are certain techniques that people figured out that end up being so terrible they had to be banned. The clothesline, the thumb in the eye, all that sort of stuff, you had to take it out because the game was too bad and everybody was losing. And so that's the way we have to start thinking about elections.
Yeah, it's, the trust but verify phrase, it's a long time to say gerrymandering. Both parties are prone to use and abuse their power to help their friends and hurt their enemies. And I think that the subtext of a lot of these electoral laws are, helping your friends, hurting your enemies. And in a winner-take-all system, if you can shift 3% of the vote in a close state like Georgia, that's a pretty darn big deal that changes a win to a loss, or vice versa. And sadly, when you let legislators kind of be able to control that, choice, they're prone to do it. So what's the balance between allowing legislators the freedom to choose their rules, which actually we do in our constitutions? We don't dictate kind of electoral rules, but what's the constraint that we should be looking for to make sure that sort of partisan calculations don't drive what happens? I'll let either of you mull that and answer that one.
Well, this is why I'm mooting this question of universal voting. That would be a constraint that would change that. It would put the burden on our public officials to get ballots in the hands of people. And failure to do so would be a failure of our state agents rather than a failure of voters to get there on time or whatnot. I think that is something that could be pursued at the level of state constitutions, state legislation. So it's another, that's a way to approach it. Another one would be to go ahead and pursue, automatic voter registration as a way of saying, there's a sort of limit here on what you can do to avoid or to sort of affect who's got access to participation at a fundamental level. So I do think clarifying what some of the bright line ground rules should be and affirming those at fundamental levels, constitutional levels, this may be the time.
I think it's
comment on that question as well.
Sure, I think it's tough. I have not figured out kind of analytically, like where's the line where legislator discretion should be curbed, because there's just so many factors that they could play with that can create advantages. I am heartened that there are ideas out there that to some degree say, okay, we're taking this out of the political choice realm. kind of the way a constitution takes certain things off the table. It's like, okay, we're going to have, a nonpartisan Secretary of State. We're just not going to do this thing where it's a member of a party, a representative thereof. There are ideas like that floating around that are being adopted. And my feeling, though, is that we're going to have more of these moments that are kind of like, have you no decency moments of outrage where people are just aghast at what happened, where we then say, like, that was a line that was crossed. And then there will be an action, hopefully, to draw the line and to push back against that and to curb political action from stepping over that line. And if we're fortunate through education and advocacy, such reforms might get picked up state to state, and we can just muddle our way forward to a better system.
So there's a couple specific ideas that have been raised in the chat. One is term limits, and another is the national popular vote plan for president. Both of these are ones that you see a lot of action on in states. Any reactions to those ideas from questioners? Going once, going twice.
I'm sorry, Rob, I couldn't quite hear you because
sorry.
Outside my apartment, there was an explosion of dog barking as apparently two people living here had collided in the fight.
Sound reform. So term limits, forcing turnover in Congress so you don't get entrenched career politicians. The national popular vote plan for president, which would replace the current state-based electoral college system where each state has its own popular vote, but states joining together to collectively establish a national popular vote for president.
Yeah, term limits, I understand they appeal. As Americans, we like to think that anybody with common sense can stride into the state house or to the Capitol and kind of use horse sense to govern in a good way. But I think the reality is that governance is so fantastically complex that having folks cycle in there, every 4 or 8 years just exacerbates the problem of amateurism. And, some of the sharpest people you will find hanging out around state houses and Capitol Hill are lobbyists. These are people who know issues inside out, and many of them can run circles around the average member of Congress on a particular issue. This is why lobbyists frequently write bills, because they know so much more than the people on Capitol Hill, which gets back to Danielle's point about congressional capacity and gutting the analytical capacity of Congress, coming back to haunt the institution. Instead of having the smarties inside Congress writing the bills, too often it's the Sharpies outside writing the bill. And my friends in the political science community who've studied term limits at the state level have generally found that legislative performance is worse in places with tight term limits.
Yeah, no, I'm in the same place on term limits, and I'm also a skeptic about the national popular vote idea. I think we have to acknowledge that we have a federal system, and the challenge with national popular vote is just, again, that it would remove the protective small bit of weighting in favor of less populous places that we have through the Electoral College. And that is one of these delicate mechanisms that keeps the thing together. Again, it can't be an overweighting of protection in favor of less populous places, because that undermines legitimacy the other way around. But if we had a national popular vote, that would mean that the more densely populated parts of the country just swamped the rest in terms of elections. We would not have a basis for ongoing, continuing collaboration. So
here's a question about sort of things going on out there. So 2021, so it's an off-year election for much of the United States. A lot of cities having elections, some states. So probably the two most prominent elections this year, I would say, are the Virginia governor's race and the New York City mayor's race. Those are two big ones. And in Virginia governor's race, Republicans are using ranked choice voting to nominate their candidates for governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general at an unassembled convention that they'll be having on May 8th. New York City, all the parties will be nominating candidates for mayor and other offices with ranked choice voting. Should be fascinating, open, big, wide open races. As you look at upcoming elections, where would you wish we had ranked choice voting in the next 2 or 3 years that we might not have it?
I mean, Kevin should answer this one because I would wish we had it everywhere. So in that regard, I don't have a very well targeted answer for you. I mean, just across the board, I think, we would be better off if candidates had to get past 50% in order to win. Just across the board, that should be the standard expectation.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Kevin, on your side?
Yeah. I'd be curious to see it rolled out in places where we've seen an obvious, intense flaring up of really extreme partisanism. And one place that certainly comes to mind is Pennsylvania. The action of the state legislature there, it's crossed some of those lines that you don't think should be crossed. And what you can see is that they are very much representing only a sliver. The representatives are peculiar, they have many constituents, yet they are only representing a sliver of them in these kind of extreme stands they're taking. And I'd be very curious, just as a natural experiment, to let's run an RCV or Final Four or Final Five there and see if we get something different.
Yeah. For those who are getting the terminology, keep an eye on Alaska. That's going to use this combination of an open blanket primary system with ranked choice voting. That means functionally, one aspect of it is that more than one candidate from the same major party can advance to the November ballot, and then there's ranked choice voting in November. So Lisa Murkowski in Alaska will be participating in that kind of election next year. So that's going to get up a lot of attention.
If I may just add, Rob, I forgot, I live in Washington, D.C. It'd be great if they rolled it out here. Because right now, as a registered independent, I don't vote in the primary. I don't get a ballot. It's just not permitted. So.
Yeah. Well, that's I did want to ask a question. I know we're going to be wrapping this up soon, but just in the sense of like multi-party democracy in the United States. So we have this sort of two dominant parties. There are factions within the parties. There's been a couple of questions in chat sort of relating to the existing factions that do exist, though not as many in the kind of the Madisonian way, or they don't necessarily kind of solve problems together. But should we have more named political parties winning seats? What would that do to polarization? Let either of you answer that one.
Feel free, Kevin. You can go for it.
You might be muted, Kevin, or I'm not hearing you if you're talking.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I guess it's about what level of governance we're talking about. When I think of city councils, I think many of those are entities that could lend themselves to a really diverse representation instead of just a simple blue shirt, red shirt exercise. When I get to Congress, I get a little confounded because the way the institution is structured, the way you could build majorities, it's greatly simplified by having two parties. And for most of the 20th century, they were two parties that were fairly diverse in their policy positions. And so when I try to map over like 5 parties operating in the House of Representatives, my concern is, does that actually incentivize needing to give more power to the speaker, whomever he or she may be, in order to whip people into a majority that can actually enact a bill? Maybe, maybe not. It's just something I haven't quite figured out yet.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to see. Maybe we'll get a chance to see what happens. There's obviously a great time of tumult in our country. I think that the kind of challenges we face are not going to be fixed with a wand or a single thing that's going to happen in the next couple of years. So I think we are at a time, and I think what Yuval Levin answered, or said at the end of his remarks, like, we are the people in this case, and we not just looking at problems, but we are looking at changes. I will elevate the Fair Representation Act when we talked about ways to kind of avoid temptation. I think the Fair Representation Act essentially would take gerrymandering off the table. Ranked choice voting takes away the temptation of trying to game elections with strategic use of elevating third parties or independents to try to split votes. There are some basic things that we can do to make politics better. So I'm really so happy that you could join us. Both Danielle and Kevin are well-published authors. Rush and see their books. Our Common Purpose Report is a very live set of recommendations about ways we can make our democracy better. Thanks so much for your questions. I'm going to stay once we close this, as if Emily lets me, to actually kind of engage with more of the questions, which I was not able to do while talking. So if you had some urgent interest in seeing how I might answer a question, I'll try to do that. But stay tuned also for our next webinar. FairVote's next webinar is Tuesday, April 27th, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, the basics of ranked choice voting election administration, which is particularly timely right now with the rollout of ranked choice voting in New York City, which is by far our nation's biggest city, and using ranked choice voting in June for the first time for all voters. We'll be in the modern era, I should say. We'll be joined by the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, and they'll talk about what it takes to administer ranked choice voting elections. Visit fairvote.org and click on Spring Webinar Series for more information to RSVP. And I'll just say again, Kevin and Danielle, it's been terrific to talk. To be continued. We got a lot of work to do, and I really appreciate the contributions that you've made to helping us think about how to make things better. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Rob. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Good to meet you, Kevin. Take care.
All right, thanks all. I'll jump into that Q&A.